The morning sun painted golden streaks across the grand courtyard of Kensington Palace as Captain James Morrison adjusted his red uniform for what he believed would be another ordinary day. 23 years of service to the crown had taught him that royal duties followed predictable patterns. The changing of the guard happened at precisely 9 o'clock, breakfast was served to the young royals at 8:30, and security briefings occurred every Tuesday without fail. But this Tuesday felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the unusual silence that hung in the air, or maybe it was the way Prince George had been watching him lately with those thoughtful eyes that seemed far too wise for a 10-year-old boy. James had noticed the young prince observing him during his rounds, not with the casual curiosity children usually showed toward palace guards, but with something deeper. Something that made James wonder what thoughts were spinning behind that serious little face. The palace buzzed with its typical morning energy. Footmen hurried through corridors carrying silver trays. Housekeepers whispered instructions to newer staff members, and security personnel checked their positions throughout the sprawling residence. James walked his familiar route, his polished boots clicking against marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. His sharp eyes automatically scanned each room, each corridor, each shadow where danger might hide. As he passed the breakfast room, James caught a glimpse of the young royals through the partially open door. Prince George sat straight in his chair, picking at his toast while his younger siblings chattered about their plans for the day. But the boy's attention wasn't on his breakfast or his family's conversation. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the window, watching James as he conducted his security sweep of the garden beyond. Their eyes met for just a moment through the glass. James nodded respectfully, as protocol demanded when acknowledging a member of the royal family. But something in George's expression made him pause. The child didn't smile or wave like children typically did when they spotted the colorful palace guards. Instead, he simply watched with an intensity that made James feel as though he were being evaluated, measured against some invisible standard. The moment passed, and James continued his rounds. But the feeling lingered. In all his years of service, he had protected 3 generations of the royal family. He had stood guard during state dinners where world leaders gathered to discuss matters of international importance. He had maintained vigilant watch during royal weddings where millions of eyes around the globe focused on every detail. He had been present during times of celebration and periods of profound grief when the nation looked to the monarchy for stability and comfort. Through it all, James had prided himself on being invisible when necessary, a silent sentinel whose presence provided security without intrusion. Royal protection officers were trained to blend into the background, to anticipate problems before they developed, and to respond with decisive action when required. They were taught that their role was to serve without seeking recognition, to protect without expecting gratitude, and to remain professional regardless of personal feelings or circumstances. But, lately, James had begun to question whether his dedication was truly valued or simply taken for granted. Small incidents had accumulated over recent months, like drops of water eventually filling a bucket. There was the time when he had worked a double shift during a security alert, missing his daughter's school play, only to receive a brief acknowledgement from his supervisor. There was the occasion when he had identified a potential threat during a public appearance, preventing what could have been a serious incident, yet the commendation he received seemed almost perfunctory. The demands of royal protection work had always been intense. Officers were expected to maintain peak physical condition, undergo regular psychological evaluations, and demonstrate unwavering loyalty to the crown. They worked long hours in all weather conditions, remained alert during mind-numbingly boring ceremonial events, and sacrificed personal time whenever duty called. The job required them to be ready to risk their lives without hesitation. Yet the emotional toll of such constant vigilance was rarely acknowledged or addressed. James had joined the Royal Protection Service straight from military service, drawn by the honor of serving the crown and the elite nature of the unit. He had believed that protecting the royal family was among the highest forms of public service, a calling that went beyond mere employment. For years, that belief had sustained him through difficult assignments, family sacrifices, and the everyday stresses that came with keeping some of the most recognizable people in the world safe from harm. But time had a way of wearing down even the strongest convictions. James had watched younger officers arrive full of enthusiasm and dedication, only to become cynical when they realized that royal protection work often meant being treated as expensive furniture. They were expected to be present but not noticed, protective but not intrusive, professional but never personal. The emotional distance required by the role sometimes made officers feel more like sophisticated security equipment than human beings with feelings, families, and needs of their own. As James completed his morning rounds, he found himself thinking about his own family more than usual. His wife Sarah had been patient through years of missed dinners, canceled holidays, and emergency calls that pulled him away from important family moments. His daughter Emma, now 15, had grown up with a father whose work often took precedence over school events and birthday parties. His son Michael, 13, had stopped asking when Daddy would be home from his special important job protecting the royal family. The irony wasn't lost on James that while he dedicated his life to protecting someone else's family, his own family sometimes felt neglected. Sarah had never complained directly, but he could see the disappointment in her eyes when he received yet another call requiring his immediate presence at the palace. The children had learned to adapt their expectations, understanding that Daddy's work was important even if they didn't fully comprehend why it always seemed more important than their soccer games or school concerts. Standing in the palace garden as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, James wondered if the sacrifice was truly worth it. He looked back toward the breakfast room window where Prince George had been sitting earlier. The boy was no longer visible, probably having finished his meal and moved on to lessons or play. But the memory of those serious, observant eyes remained with James as he contemplated a decision that had been forming in his mind for several weeks. Perhaps it was time to consider whether his years of loyal service had run their course. Perhaps it was time to think about what life might look like beyond these palace walls, where his dedication to duty wouldn't require him to miss his own children's childhoods. Perhaps it was time to step down from a role that had defined him for more than 2 decades but was beginning to feel like a burden rather than an honor. The afternoon brought an unexpected change to the palace routine. Prince George had requested permission to spend time in the library, a vast room filled with leather-bound books that stretched from floor to ceiling. This wasn't unusual in itself, as the young prince was known for his love of reading and learning. But today he had specifically asked that Captain Morrison be assigned to his security detail during this quiet time. James received the request with some surprise. Typically, the senior protection officers rotated their assignments based on threat levels and scheduling needs. For a simple afternoon of reading in the palace library, a junior officer would normally provide adequate security. But the request had come through proper channels, and James found himself walking toward the library with questions swirling in his mind. The library was one of James's favorite rooms in the palace. Unlike the formal state rooms with their gilded decorations and priceless artwork, the library felt comfortable and lived in. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air above reading tables where generations of royal children had done their lessons and pursued their interests. Prince George was already there when James arrived, seated at a small desk near one of the windows with several books spread before him. He looked up as James entered and nodded politely before returning his attention to his reading. James positioned himself near the door, maintaining his usual professional stance while keeping watch over the room's entrances and sight lines. For nearly an hour, they shared the quiet space in comfortable silence. James found himself relaxing slightly in the peaceful atmosphere, though his training kept him alert to any sounds or movements that might indicate a security concern. Prince George read steadily, occasionally making notes in a small notebook with the careful handwriting expected of a child receiving excellent education. Then, something unexpected happened. The young prince closed his book softly and looked directly at James with those same serious eyes that had caught his attention that morning. "Captain Morrison," George said quietly, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation that came from years of speech coaching. "May I ask you something?" James was momentarily taken aback. In all his years of royal protection duty, he couldn't remember a time when one of the children had initiated a personal conversation with him. Protocol was clear about maintaining appropriate distance and formality, but the request came from a member of the royal family, and refusing would be inappropriate. "Of course, Your Highness," James replied, maintaining his professional tone while moving slightly closer to better hear the boy's quiet voice. George looked down at his hands for a moment before meeting James's eyes again. "Do you like your job protecting us?" The directness of the question caught James completely off guard. He had expected perhaps a question about security procedures or maybe curiosity about the weapons and equipment protection officers carried. This personal inquiry was something entirely different and far more complex to answer truthfully while remaining appropriate. It is my honor to serve the crown and protect your family, Your Highness, James responded carefully, falling back on the formal language of his training. But George tilted his head slightly, a gesture that reminded James powerfully of the boy's father when he was considering something carefully. That's not what I asked, the prince said gently but firmly. I asked if you like it. Not if you think it's honorable or important, but if it makes you happy. James felt his carefully maintained professional composure waver slightly. This was definitely not a conversation covered in any training manual he had ever studied. Yet there was something in the child's manner that suggested this wasn't casual curiosity, but something more significant. Why do you ask, Your Highness? James said, attempting to redirect the conversation while buying himself time to think. George was quiet for a long moment, looking out the library window toward the gardens where other staff members could be seen going about their daily duties. When he spoke again, his words were carefully chosen. I've been watching you lately, the boy admitted. You look sad sometimes when you think no one is paying attention. And yesterday, when you were talking on your phone in the corridor, I heard you tell someone that you might miss another school event because of work. You sounded upset about it. James felt a chill run through him. He prided himself on maintaining professional composure at all times while on duty. The idea that a 10-year-old had been observing him closely enough to notice his emotional state was both embarrassing and concerning. How many other people had noticed if his feelings were so transparent to a child? I apologize if I've been unprofessional in any way, Your Highness, James said stiffly. My personal concerns shouldn't be apparent while I'm performing my duties. You haven't been unprofessional, George said quickly, seeming to sense that he might have offended the guard. You've always been very good at your job. That's why I notice when you seem unhappy. It's like when our dogs are sick, but still try to do their tricks because they want to please us. They're still good dogs, but you can tell something is wrong. The comparison was both innocent and surprisingly insightful. James found himself looking at this young prince with new respect for his observational skills and emotional intelligence. It was clear that despite his privileged upbringing, George was developing a genuine awareness of the people around him as individuals rather than simply as servants fulfilling their roles. Sometimes adults have worries about balancing different parts of their lives, James said carefully. But that doesn't mean I'm not committed to keeping you and your family safe. George nodded seriously. I know you would protect us no matter what. That's why I wanted to talk to you today. I've been thinking about something, and I wanted you to know that I understand some things that maybe other people don't think I understand. The weight of the boy's words settled over the quiet library like a blanket. James realized that this conversation was heading somewhere significant, though he couldn't yet imagine where. The prince seemed to be building up to something important, and James found himself genuinely curious about what insights this remarkable child might share. What kinds of things do you understand, Your Highness? James asked, abandoning his attempt to maintain purely formal distance. I understand that protecting us means you have to give up things that are important to you, George said simply. And I understand that sometimes people think we don't notice or care about what our protection costs the people who take care of us. But I do notice. And I do care. The sincerity in the young prince's voice was unmistakable. James felt something shift inside him as he realized that his years of service hadn't gone unnoticed or unappreciated. This child, who could have grown up completely oblivious to the sacrifices made by the people around him, had instead developed a genuine awareness of the human cost of royal protection. I also understand, George continued, his voice dropping even lower, that sometimes when people have given a lot for a long time, they need to think about what's best for their own families too. And that doesn't make them bad people or disloyal. It just makes them human. James felt his breath catch in his throat. Somehow, this 10-year-old had managed to articulate something that James himself had been struggling to understand about his own situation. The permission implicit in the boy's words, the understanding that duty and personal needs could sometimes conflict without either being wrong, was something James had never expected to hear, especially not from a member of the royal family. The silence that followed Prince George's words stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. James found himself staring at this remarkable child who had somehow seen through his professional facade to understand struggles he had barely admitted to himself. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the library floor and creating an atmosphere of intimate conversation despite the formal setting. Your Highness, James began slowly. I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to tell me. George looked down at the books on his desk, running his small fingers along the leather binding of what appeared to be a history book about royal traditions. When he looked up again, There was a determination in his expression that reminded James powerfully of the boy's grandmother, the late Queen, who had been known for her ability to make difficult decisions with grace and clarity. "My tutor has been teaching me about history," George said carefully, "about how the monarchy has changed over the years, and why it's important for royal families to understand the people who serve them. She says that good leaders know when to hold on tight, and when to let go with kindness." James felt his eyebrows rise slightly. The boy was clearly leading up to something specific, but the direction of his thoughts remained unclear. The mention of tutoring reminded James that despite his young age, Prince George was receiving an education designed to prepare him for eventual leadership responsibilities that most people could barely imagine. "She also told me," George continued, "that sometimes the kindest thing a leader can do is to notice when someone is given everything they can give, and to help them find a way to step back with honor instead of waiting until they break under the weight of their duty." The words hit James like a physical blow. This child had not only noticed his internal struggle, but had apparently discussed it with his tutor and developed what sounded remarkably like a plan. The sophistication of the boy's thinking was both impressive and slightly overwhelming. "What exactly are you suggesting, Your Highness?" James asked, though part of him was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. George straightened in his chair with a formality that seemed far beyond his years. "I want to do something that might seem strange, but I've thought about it very carefully. I want to write a letter." "A letter?" "To my father," George clarified, "explaining that I think you should be allowed to step down from royal protection duty if that's what would be best for you and your family. But not because you've done anything wrong or because anyone is unhappy with your service. Because sometimes good people need to choose their families, and that should be respected." James felt the world shift slightly around him. The idea that this 10-year-old would consider intervening on his behalf with his father, the future King of England, was almost too extraordinary to process. The potential complications, the breach of protocol, the sheer audacity of the gesture left James speechless. "Your Highness, I couldn't possibly ask you to do such a thing," James managed to say. "The decision about my career is something I need to handle through proper channels with my supervisors." "You're not asking me," George pointed out with logic that was difficult to argue against. "I'm offering. And I think maybe sometimes the proper channels don't understand everything that's important." The boy stood up from his desk and walked over to one of the tall windows, looking out at the gardens where James had walked his security rounds that morning. The late afternoon sun caught the highlights in his hair and cast his young profile in sharp relief against the glass. "Last week, I heard my father talking to someone about staffing challenges in the protection unit," George said without turning around. He was worried about keeping good officers happy and making sure people don't burn out from the stress of the job. He said that losing experienced people was bad for security and bad for the families who work so hard to take care of us. James remained silent, processing this information. It wasn't surprising that staff retention would be a concern at the highest levels, but hearing that the Prince of Wales was personally aware of the issue added another layer of complexity to his own situation. George turned back to face James, and, for a moment, the adult-like seriousness in his expression was replaced by something more childlike and uncertain. "I've never written a letter like this before. I'm not sure exactly how to say what I want to say, but I think it's important to try." The vulnerability in the boy's admission touched something deep in James's chest. Despite his royal upbringing and obvious intelligence, George was still a child trying to navigate complex adult problems with the tools available to him. The fact that he was willing to step outside his comfort zone to advocate for someone else's well-being spoke to a character that would likely serve him well in his future role. "What would you say in this letter?" James asked quietly. George returned to his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper from a drawer. "I would tell my father that you've been protecting our family for a very long time, and that you've always been professional and dedicated. I would explain that I've noticed you seem worried about missing important things with your own children, and that I think a good father should be able to be present for his family too." James watched as the boy began to sketch out notes on the paper, his handwriting careful and deliberate. There was something profoundly moving about seeing this young prince working so seriously on behalf of someone else's family life. "I would also tell him," George continued as he wrote, "that I believe you would always put our safety first, even if staying means sacrificing things that are important to you. But that maybe we should care about what's important to you too, because that's what good people do for each other." The simplicity and sincerity of the boy's approach was overwhelming. James found himself struggling with emotions he had kept carefully controlled for years. The idea that his service had been noticed and valued by this child, that his internal conflict had been recognized and understood, was something he had never expected. "Your Highness," James said, his voice rougher than usual, "I'm deeply moved that you would consider doing something like this. But I'm concerned about putting you in a position where you're involved in adult employment decisions." George looked up from his writing with a small smile that reminded James that despite his serious demeanor, this was still a 10-year-old boy. "My tutor says that learning to care about the people around you is one of the most important parts of leadership training. She says it's never too early to practice being the kind of person who notices when someone needs help." The wisdom of this statement, clearly passed down from an excellent educator, struck James as exactly the kind of lesson that would help shape a future monarch who truly understood his role in relation to the people he would one day serve. "Besides," George added with a slightly mischievous glint in his eye, "I've been practicing my letter-writing skills and lessons. My tutor says my formal correspondence has improved significantly, and I should look for opportunities to use what I've learned." Despite the emotional weight of the conversation, James found himself smiling at this reminder that underneath all the serious discussion was still a child who was proud of his academic progress and eager to demonstrate his new skills. 3 days after his conversation with Prince George in the library, James found himself standing outside the Prince of Wales's private study, summoned by a formal but courteous request for a meeting. His mind had been racing since receiving the message that morning, wondering if the young prince had actually followed through on his plan to write the letter, and, if so, what the consequences might be. The study door opened, and James was invited inside by a private secretary who then discreetly withdrew, leaving him alone with the future king. The room was comfortable and lived in, with family photographs on the desk and shelves lined with books on everything from architecture to environmental conservation. The Prince of Wales looked up from some papers he had been reviewing and gestured for James to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Captain Morrison," the prince began with a warmth that immediately put James more at ease. "Thank you for making time to meet with me today. I hope you don't mind the informality of this setting, but I wanted to have a private conversation with you about something rather important." James felt his pulse quicken, but he maintained his professional composure. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. How may I assist you?" The prince leaned back in his chair with a slight smile that reminded James strongly of his eldest son. "I received an interesting letter a few days ago from George. Quite a remarkable piece of correspondence, actually. He wrote to me about you." James's heart sank. Despite Prince George's good intentions, he couldn't help but worry that this unprecedented breach of protocol might reflect poorly on his own professionalism. "Your Royal Highness, if Prince George has overstepped any boundaries, I take full responsibility for—" "Please, don't apologize," the prince interrupted gently. "George's letter was one of the most thoughtful and mature pieces of writing I've received from him. He demonstrated a level of awareness and compassion that made me quite proud of the young man he's becoming." Relief flooded through James, though he remained uncertain about where this conversation was heading. The prince picked up a sheet of paper from his desk, and James recognized the careful handwriting of Prince George. "Would you mind if I read you a portion of what he wrote? I think you should hear his words directly." James nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The prince cleared his throat softly and began to read. "Dear Papa, I am writing to you about Captain Morrison, who has been protecting our family for many years. I have been observing him recently, and I have noticed that he seems conflicted about his work. I believe he is worried about missing important events in his own children's lives because of his dedication to protecting us." The prince paused and looked up at James. He goes on to explain his understanding of the situation quite eloquently. But the part that really caught my attention was this. He continued reading. "I know that Captain Morrison would never complain or ask for anything because he is a professional and he cares about his duty. But I think we should care about his family too, because that is what good people do. If he needs to step down to be a better father to his own children, I think we should help him do that with honor and gratitude for all the years he has protected us." James felt his eyes sting with unexpected emotion. Hearing his internal struggle articulated so clearly and compassionately by this remarkable child was overwhelming. The fact that Prince George had understood not just the surface situation but also the deeper conflict between duty and family was extraordinary. George concluded his letter. The prince continued, by suggesting that perhaps there was a way to recognize your years of service while allowing you to transition to a role that would give you more time with your family. He specifically mentioned that he thought this would be better for everyone involved than waiting until the stress of the situation caused bigger problems. The prince set down the letter and regarded James thoughtfully. I must say, his analysis of the situation struck me as remarkably insightful. It also prompted me to look into several things I should have been paying closer attention to. James waited, unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. I had a conversation with the head of the protection unit about staff retention and work-life balance. The prince continued. What I learned was quite concerning. We've been losing good officers at an alarming rate, and many of those who remain are struggling with exactly the kinds of conflicts George observed in you. The prince stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the same gardens where James had walked his morning rounds just days earlier. It seems that my son has identified a problem that the adults in charge should have been addressing more proactively. Your Royal Highness, James said carefully, I want you to know that my personal concerns have never compromised my ability to perform my duties to the highest standard. I have no doubt about that, the prince replied, turning back to face him. Your record speaks for itself. 23 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations, and the complete trust of everyone who has worked with you. That's precisely why losing you would be such a significant blow to the protection team. James felt a moment of confusion. Losing me, sir? The prince returned to his desk with a slight smile. Well, that would be the traditional outcome, wouldn't it? A dedicated officer reaches his breaking point, submits his resignation, and we lose all that experience and expertise while scrambling to train someone new. But George's letter got me thinking about whether there might be better alternatives. James leaned forward slightly, intrigued by the direction of the conversation. I've been discussing with my staff the possibility of creating some new positions within the royal household, the prince explained. Roles that would utilize the experience and skills of senior protection officers while providing more predictable schedules and better work-life balance. The idea was so unexpected that James wasn't sure he had heard correctly. New positions, Your Royal Highness. Security consulting, training coordination for new officers, liaison work with other protection services, the prince elaborated. Responsibilities that would keep your expertise within the royal household while allowing you to have a more normal family life. The kind of role where missing your daughter's school play wouldn't be an occupational hazard. James stared at the prince, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. The solution was so far beyond anything he had imagined that he struggled to process the implications. Obviously, the prince continued, such positions would need to be developed carefully and approved through proper channels. But I wanted to speak with you first to see if this kind of arrangement might address the concerns that George so thoughtfully brought to my attention. The generosity and understanding implicit in the offer was almost overwhelming. James realized that not only had Prince George's intervention been successful, but it had prompted a much broader reconsideration of how the royal household managed its most valuable personnel. I don't know what to say, Your Royal Highness, James admitted. This is far more than I ever expected or hoped for. You might start by saying whether such an arrangement would interest you, the prince suggested with a warm smile. Because if it would, then I think we should have George help us figure out how to structure these new roles. After all, his analysis of the problem was spot on. Perhaps he has some ideas about solutions as well. 6 months later, James Morrison stood in the same library where his life had been transformed by an extraordinary conversation with a 10-year-old prince. But now, instead of wearing the red uniform of a royal protection officer, he was dressed in a business suit as the newly appointed senior security consultant to the royal household. The transformation had been remarkable, not just for him personally, but for the entire approach to staff welfare within the palace. The new position had exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. James now worked regular hours, was home for dinner most nights, and had attended every one of his children's important events since the transition. His expertise was valued in new ways as he helped design training programs for incoming protection officers, developed improved security protocols, and served as a liaison between the royal household and various security agencies. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of his new role was the time he spent mentoring other long-serving staff members who were facing similar challenges balancing duty with family life. The program that had begun with his situation had expanded to help numerous palace employees find sustainable ways to continue serving the crown while maintaining healthy personal lives. Prince George entered the library carrying a small stack of books, just as he had on that afternoon 6 months earlier. But now there was an easy familiarity between them that had developed through several subsequent conversations about leadership responsibility, and the importance of caring for the people around you. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morrison," the boy said with a formal politeness that still carried genuine warmth. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," James replied, noting how much the prince seemed to have grown and matured even in this relatively short time. George settled into his usual chair near the window and looked at James with those same thoughtful eyes that had started this entire journey. "My tutor says that leaders should always follow up on their decisions to see if they worked out the way they planned. So I wanted to ask you how everything has been going." James smiled at the boy's direct approach, which had become a familiar and appreciated aspect of their interactions. "Everything has been going very well, Your Highness. Better than I dared to hope when we first spoke." "And your family?" George asked with genuine concern. "Are you able to be with them more now?" "Much more," James confirmed. "I was able to attend my daughter's graduation ceremony last month, and I've been helping my son with his cricket practice twice a week. My wife says I seem happier and more relaxed than I've been in years." George nodded with satisfaction, clearly pleased that his intervention had produced the desired results. "My father told me that other people in the palace have been helped by the new programs too." "That's right," James said. "Your letter didn't just change my situation, Your Highness. It started a whole new way of thinking about how the royal household can support its staff while maintaining the highest standards of service." The boy considered this for a moment, absently turning the pages of one of his books. "My tutor says that sometimes small actions can have big consequences, but you can't always predict what those consequences will be. She says that's why it's important to act from good intentions, and then pay attention to what happens next." James was continually impressed by the quality of education Prince George was receiving and how seriously he took the lessons about leadership and responsibility. It was clear that he was being prepared not just for his future role as monarch, but for a lifetime of thoughtful decision-making and genuine care for others. "I have something for you," George said, reaching into his school bag and pulling out a carefully wrapped package. "It's not a present exactly, but something I thought you might like to have." James accepted the package with curiosity and carefully unwrapped it to reveal a leather-bound photo album. On the cover, embossed in gold letters, were the words 23 years of dedicated service. "Open it," George encouraged with barely contained excitement. James opened the album to find it filled with photographs documenting his years of royal protection service. There were formal shots from state occasions, candid photos from family events, and images he had never seen before that captured him performing his duties over more than 2 decades. Each photograph was carefully mounted and labeled with dates and occasions. "How did you get all these photographs?" James asked in amazement. "I asked the palace photographer to help me find pictures of you from over the years," George explained. "And my father contributed some from his personal collection. He said that people who serve the crown for so long should have a record of their dedication." James turned the pages slowly, seeing his younger self in early photos and noting how the years had changed him. There were pictures of him at royal weddings, state dinners, public appearances, and countless other occasions where he had provided security with quiet professionalism. Near the end of the album was a photograph he didn't recognize, showing him in deep conversation with Prince George in this very library on the afternoon that had changed everything. Someone had captured that pivotal moment without either of them being aware of it. "Who took this picture?" James asked, pointing to the image. George grinned with a mischief that reminded James that despite his serious nature, he was still very much a child. "My father had someone take it after I told him about our conversation. He said it might be important to document the moment when I learned that good leadership sometimes means asking difficult questions and having brave conversations." The final page of the album contained a handwritten note from Prince George, carefully composed in his neat script. "Thank you for protecting our family with such dedication for so many years. Thank you for teaching me that it's important to notice when people need help, even when they don't ask for it. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the right thing to do is also the brave thing to do. I hope your new role brings you happiness and gives you more time with the people who love you." James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he read the boy's words. The thoughtfulness behind this gesture, the time and effort that had gone into creating such a meaningful keepsake, spoke to a level of character that gave him great hope for the future of the monarchy. "This is incredibly thoughtful, Your Highness," James managed to say. "I'll treasure it always. My tutor says that recognizing people's contributions is one of the most important responsibilities of leadership," George replied seriously. "She says that when people give their best efforts to serve others, they should know that their service matters and is remembered." James looked around the library where this remarkable journey had begun, thinking about how a simple conversation between a guard and a prince had led to transformations neither of them could have anticipated. The boy's willingness to speak up had not only changed James's life, but had inspired broader reforms that would benefit countless other staff members for years to come. "Your Highness," James said carefully, "I hope you know that what you did took real courage. Speaking up for someone else, especially when it meant stepping outside normal protocol, wasn't easy. But it was the right thing to do." Prince George looked thoughtful for a moment before responding. "My tutor says that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what you believe is right, even when you're not sure how it will turn out. I was nervous about writing that letter, but I knew that staying silent would be worse than trying to help." The wisdom in this statement, clearly the product of excellent teaching combined with the boy's own developing moral compass, filled James with confidence about the kind of leader Prince George would eventually become. As the afternoon sun began to set through the library windows, casting the same golden light that had illuminated their first conversation, James reflected on how profoundly his life had been changed by one young prince's decision to pay attention, to care, and to act. Prince George's silent observation had led to action that changed everything, proving that sometimes the most powerful interventions come from the most unexpected sources.